In the days when Beleriand yet lay green and fair beneath the light of the two trees, ere Morgoth had dimmed the world with shadow and flame, there stood in the blue mountains two great mansions of the Khazad, Nogrod, the hollow dwelling, and Belegost, the great fortress. Of these, Belegost was renowned above all others for the skill of its smiths and the strength of its warriors, for they alone among the peoples of Middle-earth had withstood the fire of Glorung the Golden and lived to tell the tale. In those days, there dwelt in the deepest halls of Belegost one whose name was Thorek Ironforge, son of Borin, son of Nali, of the line of the Broadbeam. Yet among his kindred, he was called by another name, Khazad Gabil, which is to say, Great Smith, in the tongue of the dwarves, for his craft surpassed that of all others in the working of metal, save perhaps Telchar of Nogrod himself. Long had Thorek labored at the great forge, which was set in the very heart of the mountain, where the fires of the earth burned eternal. Here he wrought works of wonder, mail coats that no blade could pierce, axes that could cleave the hardest stone, and blades that sang with their own light in the darkness. Yet for all his skill, there was one work that eluded him, one task that called to him in dreams and waking hours alike, the forging of a weapon that might stand against the terror of the Dark Lord himself. Upon a day in the 600th year of the First Age, when the spring was young and the mountain streams ran full with melted snow, there came to the gates of Belegost a messenger out of the west. He was tall and fair after the manner of the Noldor, clad in grey mail beneath a blue cloak, and upon his brow was set a star of silver. His name was Ecthelion of the Fountain, Lord of Gondolin the Hidden, and he bore tidings that would shake the very foundations of the mountain hall. Lords of Belegost, spoke he before the throne of King Azaghal, I come from Turgun, the hidden king, with words of warning and of hope. The shadow in the north grows ever stronger, and even now Morgoth prepares his hosts for war. Yet know this, there lies hidden in the deeps of Angband a secret that might yet turn the tide of battle, could one be found with skill enough to claim it. The dwarf king leaned forward upon his throne of carved stone, his eyes bright beneath his flowing beard. Speak then, Lord of Gondolin, and let all hear thy words. In the deepest vaults of Thangorodrim, continued Ecthelion, there lies a forge built by Aule himself, in the music of creation, ere the world was shaped. It is said that at this forge were wrought the chains Angainor that bind Morgoth, and here too might be forged their match, weapons of such power that even the Valar might wonder at their making. Yet the forge lies cold and dead, for only one of the blood of Aule might kindle its fires anew. At these words, Thorek felt his heart leap within him, for he alone among all present knew the secret of his lineage, that his mother Dis had been found as a child in the wild lands east of Belegost, bearing naught but a pendant wrought of imperishable gold, and that in his dreams he oft beheld visions of a great smith, whose face was as flame and whose hammer rang with the music of the spheres. When Ecthelion had departed with the promise of King Azaghal that Belegost would consider his words, there was much debate in the halls of the dwarves. Some counseled caution, for the perils of Angband were beyond counting, and many there were who deemed it folly to risk the flower of their people upon so desperate a venture. Yet others spoke with voices raised in wrath, for they remembered well the sack of their kindred halls in bygone days, and the flames of Glaurung that had come nigh to destroying their city entire. But Thorek said little in these debates, for his mind was turned inward, and in the silence of his chamber he pondered the words of the Elf Lord. Long he sat beside his forge, watching the play of flame and shadow upon the stone, and ever the dreams came stronger, showing him visions of a mighty work that lay yet undone. Upon the 7th day after the coming of Ecthelion, King Azaghal summoned Thorek to his private chamber, where hung the great shields of the kings of old and the war axes of their mighty deeds. The king was aged beyond the measure of his people, for he had looked upon the light of the two trees in his youth, and had walked the halls of Menegroth when Thingol yet held court in splendor. Thorek, son of Borin, said the king, his voice heavy with the weight of years and wisdom. "Thou art accounted the greatest smith among our people, since the day that Telchar of Nogrod passed into the halls of his fathers. What think you of the words spoken by the Lord of Gondolin?" Thorek bowed his head, for the reverence due to the king was great. Yet when he lifted his eyes, they burned with a fire that matched the forge flame. "My lord and king," said he, "I have pondered these words, and methinks there is more in them than appears upon the surface. For I have read in the ancient books of our people, and I have seen written there, that Aula the smith took unto himself chosen ones from among the children of Iluvatar, and set upon them his mark, that they might aid in the great work of the world's making." At these words the king raised his eyebrows, for he was wise in the lore of his people, and knew well the old tale. "And what is thy meaning in this, Master Smith?" "This, my lord, that if indeed there be such a forge as the elf lord speaks of, and if it be true that only one of Aule's blood might kindle it, then there may be found among our people one suited to such a task. For are we not the Khazad, the children of Aule's making? And might not one among us bear within himself the spark divine that could awaken the sleeping fires?" The king was silent for a long while, and his eyes searched the face of Thorek as though he would read there the secrets of his heart. At last he spoke, and his voice was filled with both hope and foreboding. "Thorek Ironforge, I perceive that thy words are not spoken without purpose. If thou dost volunteer for this quest, know well that the perils are beyond all reckoning. Angband is the stronghold of the enemy, and the very air about Thangorodrim is poison to all living things. Many there are who have entered those accursed gates, and none have returned to tell of what they found within." "This I know, my king," replied Thorek, and his voice was steady as the mountain stone. "Yet, if there be hope of forging weapons that might aid in the final battle against the shadow, then how can any of us rest while such a chance remains untaken? Better to dare greatly and fail than to sit idle while the world falls into darkness." When it became known throughout the halls of Belegost that Thorek Ironforge would undertake the perilous journey to Angband, there was great sorrow among his people, for he was beloved by all who knew him. His wife Dana wept bitter tears, and his young son Dain clung to his father's knees, begging him not to depart. Yet Thorek's resolve was firm as the mountain's root, and he would not be turned from his purpose. 3 days were given for preparation, and in that time King Azaghal commanded that the finest equipment of the realm be brought forth. To Thorek was given a hauberk of dwarf mail, wrought of mithril, harder than steel and lighter than silk, that had been made in the elder days when the skill of the smiths was at its height. Upon his head was set a helm of ancient make, carven with runes of power and protection, and at his side hung Orcrist, the goblin cleaver, a blade of Gondolin make that had come to Belegost through many adventures. Yet the greatest gift was not of metal or stone, but of knowledge. Into the hands of Thorek were placed 3 items of great worth. First, a map drawn upon imperishable vellum that showed the secret ways beneath the mountain, traced out by the spies of Belegost through long years of hidden watching. Second, a crystal phial filled with the light of Arundel's star, that no shadow might wholly overcome one who bore it. And third, most precious of all, a small hammer wrought of strange metal that gleamed with its own inner light. "This hammer," said King Azaghal, as he placed it in Thorek's hands, "was brought to my forefathers from the west, in days so ancient that their memory is dim. It is said to be wrought of the same metal as the pillars of the halls of Mando, and that it bears within it a spark of the flame imperishable. Guard it well, for I deem it may serve thee in thy greatest need." Upon the 4th day, when the sun rose red over the peaks of arid Luin, Thorek set forth from Belegost. With him went 12 of the finest warriors of his people, chosen from among the guard of the king, and their leader was Fundin the Stoutheart, whose axe had drunk deep of orc blood in many battles. Long was their farewell, and many were the blessings spoken over them as they passed beneath the great gates, and took the mountain path that led westward toward the shadow, For 7 days they journeyed through the wild lands that lay between the Blue Mountains and the river Sirion, following paths known only to the dwarves, and keeping ever to the hidden way. They passed through the forests of Brethil, where the Halidin dwelt in their tree hall, and came at last to the borders of Doriath, greatest of the elven realms that remained in Middle-earth. Here they were challenged by the march wardens of King Thingol, tall and stern of countenance, clad in grey cloaks and bearing long spears. Yet when they learned of the purpose of the company, they gave them passage and blessing, for even the elves of Doriath knew that the time was coming when all the free people must stand together against the shadow, or fall one by one into darkness. Beyond the borders of Doriath lay a land that was changed from its former beauty, for here the power of Morgoth had begun to stretch its fingers across the earth. The grass grew gray and withered, the streams ran black and foul, and no birds sang in the twisted trees. This was the beginning of that desolation which men called the Anfoglith, the gasping dust, where no living thing could long endure. Yet first they must pass through the marshes of Serech, where in the days of the Nirnaeth Arnoediad, the blood of heroes had soaked into the earth and made it cursed ground. Here dwelt creatures born of shadow and malice, and the very mists that rose from the stagnant waters were filled with whispers of despair and madness. It was upon the second day of their passage through this fell region that disaster first struck the company. They had made camp upon a small rise of ground that seemed somewhat drier than the surrounding bog, and had set watches after the manner of their people. But in the darkest hour before dawn, when the mists hung thickest about them, there came a sound that froze the blood in their veins, the howling of wolves, but not such wolves as ran in the wild woods of the world. Out of the darkness came the wargs of Angband, great and terrible beasts, whose eyes burned like coals and whose fangs dripped with venom. Upon their backs rode the orcs of Morgoth's guard, clad in black mail and bearing weapons cruelly barbed. They had been sent forth to patrol the borders of their master's realm, and the scent of the dwarven company had drawn them like carrion birds to a battlefield. The battle was fierce and swift, for the dwarves were mighty warriors, and their weapons were of the finest make. Fundin's axe sang its death song as it clove through orc mail and wolf hide alike, and the blade orcrist gleamed with cold fire as Thorek wielded it with deadly skill. Yet the enemy was numerous, and for each foe that fell, 2 more seemed to spring from the darkness. In the end, 6 of the 12 guards lay still upon the bloodied ground, and 3 more bore wounds that would slow their journey. Only Thorek, Fundin, and 2 others, Oin the Swift and Glowin Ironfoot, remained hale and able to continue the quest. Yet even in their sorrow, they pressed on, for they knew that delay would only bring more enemies upon them, and the hope of their mission was too precious to be abandoned for the sake of grief. 5 days more they journeyed through lands that grew ever more desolate and fell, until at last they came within sight of their goal. Before them rose the triple peaks of Thangorodrim, vast mountains built from the slag and refuse of Morgoth's digging, and about their roots lay spread the iron gates of Angband, greatest and most terrible of all the fortresses of evil that have been raised in Middle-earth. The very air about that place was thick with smoke and ash, and the ground beneath their feet was hot with the fires that burned in the deep places of the earth. No green thing grew for leagues about, and the sky above was dark with clouds that never brought rain, but only thunder and the red light of flame. From the gates themselves came a sound like the beating of a great heart, and with each pulse the darkness seemed to grow deeper and more oppressive. "My lord Thorek," whispered Fundin, his face pale beneath the grime of travel, "surely no living thing may enter that place and hope to emerge again. The very stones cry out with malice, and I feel my strength ebbing with each step we take toward those accursed gates." Thorek stood for a long while in silence, his eyes fixed upon the fortress of the enemy. In his hand he held the crystal phial that had been given to him in Belegost, and its light seemed small and feeble against the overwhelming darkness of that place. Yet within his heart there burned a flame that no shadow could wholly quench, and he felt the weight of the strange hammer at his belt like a promise of hope. "My friends," said he at last, his voice carrying clear despite the oppressive air, "we have come too far to turn back now, and the need of our people is too great for us to be daunted by fear. Yet I will not ask any to follow me into that darkness who does not choose freely to do so. If there be any among you who would return to Belegost and tell our king of what we have attempted, let him speak now without shame." But Fundin and the others stood firm, for they were dwarves of Belegost, and their loyalty was stronger than their fear. "We have sworn to follow thee, Thorek Ironforge," said Fundin, "and follow thee we shall, though the road lead to the very halls of Mandos himself." And so they pressed on, using all the stealth and cunning that was theirs by right of birth and training. For the Khazad are the greatest of all peoples in the craft of moving unseen through stone and earth, and even the Watchers of Morgoth could not pierce all the veils they wove about themselves. Through secret ways shown upon their ancient map, they crept, following paths that ran beneath the very foundations of Thangorodrim, until at last they came to a place where the passages opened into a vast cavern lit by the glow of distant fires. In that great cavern, they found wonders and terrors beyond description, for here were the dungeons and treasure houses and armories of Morgoth the Fallen, and here too were kept the captives taken in his wars. The very walls were built of black stone that seemed to drink in light, and from the ceiling hung stalactites, carved into the shapes of watching eyes and grasping claws. The air was filled with the sound of hammering and the cries of those who suffered, for in Angband there was no rest, neither by day nor by night. Following the map with careful steps, they made their way through passages that wound ever deeper into the heart of the mountain. Past guard chambers filled with sleeping orcs they crept, past armories where weapons of evil make hung upon walls of iron, past treasure vaults where the spoils of Morgoth's victories lay heaped in glittering piles. Yet ever they pressed on toward their goal, for Thorek felt within his heart a calling that grew stronger with each step, as though the very stones of the mountain were singing to him in a voice only he could hear. At length they came to a great door barred with bands of iron and sealed with locks that were wrought in the likeness of twisted serpents. Upon the door were carved runes in the black speech of Mordor, words of binding and warding that made the very air about them thick and hard to breathe. Yet when Thorek approached and laid his hand upon the strange hammer at his belt, the runes began to glow with a light that was neither red nor golden, but pure as the light of stars. "What sorcery is this?" whispered Oin, his voice filled with wonder and fear. But Thorek said nothing, for in that moment he felt the presence of another mind touching his own, ancient beyond measure, and wise with the wisdom of the Valor themselves. In his thoughts there came words spoken in a voice like the sound of hammers ringing upon anvils of gold. "Son of my choosing, child of the flame that burns eternal, the hour of thy testing is come. Take up thy birthright and kindle the fires that have slept too long in darkness. Yet know this, the price of such power is great, and once begun, this work cannot be undone." With trembling hands, Thorek drew forth the hammer that King Azagal had given him, and as he lifted it high, its light blazed forth like a star kindled in the depths of the earth. The iron bands upon the door began to smoke and crack. The serpent locks writhed as though in pain, and with a sound like thunder the great door swung open, revealing beyond it a chamber that had been sealed since the making of the world. Beyond the door lay a sight that struck wonder into the hearts of even the stout-hearted dwarf, for here was the forge of Auli himself, built in the music of creation and set in the deep places of the earth to await the hour of its awakening. The chamber was vast beyond measure, its walls carved from living rock into the shapes of great trees, whose branches supported a ceiling lost in shadow. In the center of the chamber stood the forge itself, wrought of stone that was neither black nor white, but seemed to contain within itself all colors and none. The forge was cold and dark, its fires long since died to ash and ember. Yet about it there hung an air of power that made the very stones beneath their feet tremble with anticipation. Beside the forge stood an anvil of meteoric iron, its surface polished smooth by countless ages of waiting, and upon it lay tools whose make was beyond the skill of any smith save the Valor themselves. As Thorek approached the forge, he felt the hammer in his hand grow warm, and its light pulsed in rhythm with the beating of his heart. The calling that had drawn him ever west was now so strong that it was like a song sung in harmony with his very soul, and he knew with certainty that this was the moment for which he had been born. Yet even as he reached toward the cold hearth of the forge, there came a sound from behind them that froze their blood, the tramp of iron-shod feet and the harsh voices of orcs calling to one another in the black speech. Their passage had not gone unnoticed after all, and now the guards of Angband were closing in upon them like hounds upon a wounded deer. "My lord," cried Fundin, his axe already in his hand, "they have found us. What would you have us do?" Thorek looked back at his faithful companions, and his heart was heavy with the knowledge of what he must ask of them. "My friends," said he, "the hour of greatest peril is upon us. I must kindle the forge and begin the work that brought us here, but I cannot do so while fending off our enemies. Will you stand guard at the door and hold them back as long as you may?" Without hesitation, Fundin and the others took their places at the entrance to the chamber, forming a line of steel and determination across the threshold. "Do thy work, Master Smith," called Fundin over his shoulder. "We shall give thee what time we can, though all the hosts of Morgoth come against us." And so began the Battle of the Forge, which bards would sing of in later days as one of the most valiant stands ever made by the children of Aule. 3 dwarves stood against the might of Angband's guards, their axes and hammers ringing against Orcblade and Wolffang, while behind them, Thorek Ironforge began the greatest work of his life. With the sounds of battle raging behind him, Thorek approached the ancient forge with reverence and awe. As he drew near, the hammer in his hand blazed with ever brighter light, and he could feel power flowing through him like molten gold in his veins. This was his moment of destiny, the purpose for which Aul himself had marked him in the secret places of his lineage. Lifting the hammer high above his head, Thorek brought it down upon the cold stones of the hearth with all his strength. The blow rang out like a bell tolled in the halls of the Valor, and at its sound, the very foundations of Thangorodrim trembled. Again he struck, and again, and with each blow, the hammer blazed brighter, and the stones began to glow with inner fire. Upon the third strike, flames sprang up from the forge, not the red flames of earthly fire, but flames of silver and gold that danced like living music in the air. The ancient bellows, untouched by any hand, began to breathe with a rhythm like the breathing of the world itself, and the forge fire leaped higher with each breath until it seemed to reach toward the very stars. Now came the true test of Thorek's skill, for he must work with materials and techniques beyond anything taught in the halls of his people. From the walls of the chamber, he drew forth metals that had no names in the tongues of Middle-earth, adamant that was harder than diamond, mithril purer than starlight, and stranger substances still that seemed to shift and flow like liquid moonbeams. All these he cast into the fire, and they melted and merged into an alloy that sang with its own voice as it heated. Behind him, the battle raged on, and he could hear the voices of his companions growing fainter as their strength began to fail. Oin had fallen, pierced by an orc spear, and Glóin fought with a broken arm, his hammer slick with blood both red and black. Only Fundin still stood strong at the threshold, his axe carving a path of destruction through the ranks of the enemy. But even his mighty strength could not hold forever against such odds. "Work swiftly, Master Smith," cried Fundin, his voice hoarse with effort. "The door will not hold much longer, and I fear that worse things than orcs are stirring in the deep places." Indeed, even as he spoke, there came a sound from the depths of Angband that made the very stones weep with terror. The roar of Glaurung the Golden, father of dragons, who had been awakened by the tumult and was even now rising from his lair to see what disturbance had dared to break the silence of his realm. As the fire blazed higher and the metal reached the perfect heat for working, Thorek felt time itself slow around him, as though the Valor themselves had granted him these precious moments to complete his task. With skill that transcended all earthly craft, he began to shape the molten alloy upon the ancient anvil, each blow of his hammer guided by wisdom older than the world. The weapon that took shape beneath his hands was unlike any blade ever forged in Middle-earth. It was neither sword, nor axe, nor spear, but partook of the nature of all weapons, changing its form as need required. One moment it blazed like a sword of flame, the next it sang like a spear of starlight, and then again it thundered like a hammer of the storm. Upon its blade were written runes in the secret script of the Valor, words of power that even Thorek did not fully comprehend, but which seemed to burn themselves into the metal as he worked. As he labored, visions came to him of the great battles yet to come, of the war of wrath, when the Valar themselves would descend from the west to do battle with Morgoth, of the fall of Beleriand beneath the waves, and of a time far in the future when a last alliance of elves and men would stand against the shadow in a land called Mordor. He saw the weapon he forged passing through many hands, serving the cause of light in each age of the world, until at last it would be wielded by one whose coming was foretold in the music of creation itself. Yet even as these visions filled his mind, the sounds of battle grew ever closer, and he knew that his time was running short. Glaurung's roar echoed through the cavern, each cry bringing the dragon nearer to their hiding place, and from the chamber's entrance came the clash of weapons and the cries of the dying. Fundin still fought on, but Thorek could hear the weariness in his battle shouts, and he knew that his faithful friend could not hold much longer. With a final effort that drew upon reserves of strength he had never known he possessed, Thorek completed the forging and held aloft the finished weapon. It blazed with a light that drove back the shadows from every corner of the chamber, and its voice was like the sound of silver bells ringing across a summer morning. In that moment of triumph, he felt the presence of Olle himself touch his mind in blessing and farewell. "Well wrought, my son," came the voice of the smith of the Valor. "Thou hast accomplished that which was given thee to do, and thy name shall be remembered when the stars grow cold. Yet know that thy work here is not finished, for this blade must be tempered in the fire of sacrifice ere its power is complete." Even as these words faded from his thoughts, the chamber door burst asunder, and through the breach came pouring the hosts of Angband. At their head stalked Gothmog, Lord of Balrogs, his whip of flame crackling in the darkness, and behind him pressed orcs and wolves and creatures of shadow beyond counting. Upon the threshold lay Fundin the Stoutheart, his axe still gripped in his dead hand, and about him were piled the bodies of his foes, like a rampart of the slain. The host of Angband poured into the sacred chamber like a black tide, their harsh voices raised in songs of mockery and malice. At their head strode Gothmog, greatest of the Balrogs after their lord who was fallen, his shadow filling the ancient halls with terror. His eyes were like coals kindled in the deepest furnaces of the earth, and in his right hand he bore a blade of flame that had drunk the blood of elven lords and kings of men. "So," rumbled the Balrog, in a voice like grinding stone, "we find a maggot of the mountain folk playing with fires too great for his understanding. Give up the blade you have wrought, little smith, and perhaps your death will be swift." But Threk stood firm beside the forge of Aule, the finished weapon blazing in his hand like a star of hope in the darkness. Though his heart was heavy with grief for his fallen companions, his spirit burned with a fire that no shadow could quench. "I am Thorek Ironforge of the line of the Broadbeam," he declared, his voice ringing clear above the tumult, "and I am no longer merely a child of earth and stone. By the power of Aule, I have wrought this blade, and by that same power I shall wield it in defense of all that is fair and free in Middle-earth." The Balrog laughed, a sound like the cracking of mountains, and raised his flame sword for the killing blow. But even as he struck, the weapon in Thorek's hand blazed forth with such brilliance that all who looked upon it were blinded, and its edge met the demon's blade with a crash that shook the very roots of Thangorodrim. For a moment, they stood locked in combat, flame against starlight, the corrupted fire of Morgoth's making striving against the pure light of creation itself. Then, with a sound like breaking glass, the Balrog's sword shattered, and Gothmog himself staggered backward with a cry of pain and rage. But their battle was interrupted by a roar that drowned out all other sound. The voice of Glaurung the Golden, who had at last reached the chamber and now filled its entrance with his vast bulk. The father of dragons was terrible to behold, his scales gleaming like molten gold, his eyes like furnaces of malice, and from his mouth poured flames that could melt stone and steel alike. "What is this that disturbs my slumber?" thundered the dragon, his gaze fixing upon Thorek and the blazing weapon in his hand. "A dwarf with a toy that shines? I have devoured the treasures of Nargothrond and looked upon the Silmarils themselves. What could a mountain maggot possibly forge that would interest Glaurung the Mighty?" Yet even as he spoke these words of mockery, the dragon's eyes narrowed, for he alone among the servants of Morgoth possessed the wisdom to recognize what Thorek had truly accomplished. The weapon bore the mark of the valor upon it, and even Glaurung's ancient malice quailed before such power. In that moment of recognition, when even the father of dragons felt the stirring of something that might have been fear, Thorek understood at last the true meaning of the words that Aulo had spoken to him. The weapon was indeed mighty beyond all mortal making, but it was not yet complete. Like the great works of the elder days, Gurthang, the iron of death, Angurel, the steel of fire, and mighty Anglichel itself, it must be tempered in sacrifice to achieve its full power. "You see truly, worm of Morgoth," said Thorek, his voice steady, though his heart was breaking with the knowledge of what he must do. "I have indeed wrought something beyond your master's power to corrupt or destroy, but its making is not yet finished, and you shall witness its completion." With these words, he leapt forward, not to strike at the dragon with his blade, but to cast himself into the very heart of Glaurung's flame. The fire of the dragon was the most terrible of all earthly flames, kindled with malice and fed upon the destruction of fair things. Yet it was still fire, and fire was the element through which Aulo worked his greatest wonders. As Thorek entered the dragon flame, his mortal flesh was consumed in an instant, but his spirit, bound to the weapon by the power of his making, did not perish. Instead, it became one with the blade itself, and the weapon blazed forth with such terrible glory that even Glaurung was forced to shield his eyes and draw back his head. The transformation was terrible and beautiful to behold. The weapon, fed by the sacrifice of its maker and tempered in dragon fire, became something more than any earthly blade could be. It became a fragment of the music of creation itself, a note of defiance sung against the discord of Morgoth, a light that no shadow could ever wholly overcome. Glaurung roared in pain and rage as the blazing weapon struck him, not wielded by any hand, but moving with a will of its own. Where it touched his golden scales, they cracked and blackened, and the dragon's own fire turned against him, burning with the light of stars instead of the darkness of malice. For the first time since his awakening, the father of dragons knew the taste of fear. Gothmog and his host fled shrieking from the chamber, for they could not bear to look upon the light that blazed from the transformed weapon. Even the stones of Angband itself groaned and cracked, as though the very fortress sought to cast out the purifying flame that burned within its heart. But the weapon's work was not yet done. Moving like a living thing, it carved its way through the passages of Angband, burning away corruption and shadow wherever it touched. Orcs fell screaming before its light, trolls crumbled to dust at its passing, and even the deepest dungeons of Morgoth's realm were cleansed by its fire. When at last the blazing weapon burst forth from the gates of Angband and soared into the gray sky above Thangorodrim, all the north was lit as though by a second sun. From Hithlum to the Falas, from the towers of Barad Nimras to the hidden realm of Gondolin, the free peoples looked up in wonder and hope, for they knew that some great work had been accomplished in the darkness of the enemy's stronghold. In Belegost, King Azagal stood upon the highest tower of his city and watched the light blaze across the western sky. Though he could not know the full tale of what had passed, his heart told him that Thorek Ironforge had achieved something beyond all hope or expectation. Tears ran down the old king's face as he whispered a prayer of thanks to Ollie the smith, and throughout the mountain halls, the sound of hammers fell silent as the dwarves paid homage to their greatest craftsman. The weapon itself, its task in Angband complete, descended from the sky and came to rest in a place that would in later days be called the Field of Celebrant. There it lay hidden beneath the grass and flowers, waiting for the time when it would be needed again. For the power that Thorek had bound into its making was beyond the dominion of any single age, and it would endure until the breaking of the world. Yet the immediate effect of the weapon's passage through Angband was felt at once. Morgoth's fortress, though not destroyed, was grievously weakened. The dark enchantments that guarded its gates were broken. Many of his servants were slain or scattered, and even Glaurung lay for long years in pain and weakness, his golden scales blackened and his fire diminished. Never again would Angband be quite so terrible a stronghold as it had been before Thorek's sacrifice. The tale of the smith of Belegost passed into legend and was sung by the minstrels of all the free people. The elves of Nargothrond wove it into their lays of the elder days, the men of Brethil carved it upon standing stone, and the dwarves themselves inscribed it in letters of gold upon the walls of their deepest halls. Yet few knew the full truth of what had passed in that ancient forge, or understood that the weapon still waited in its hidden resting place. For Thorek had accomplished something that even he had not fully understood when he began his quest. He had proven that the power of creation was stronger than the force of destruction, that the light of Auli could shine even in the deepest darkness of Morgoth's realm, and that one person willing to sacrifice everything for the sake of others could change the fate of the world itself. In the days that followed, when Gil-galad raised his banner in the west, and the last alliance was formed to challenge the Shadow in Mordor, it was whispered among the wise that they fought not merely with sword and spear, but with the blessing of the great smith, who had given his life that others might live in freedom. And when at last the Dark Lord was cast down and his ring destroyed, some said they saw a flame like starlight dancing above the field of battle, as though the spirit of Thorek Ironforge had come to witness the final victory of the light. Thus ends the tale of the smith of Belegost, who forged not merely a weapon, but hope itself in the darkness of the world's need. His name is remembered still among the Khazad, and his deed shall not be forgotten, while stone endures and metal rings upon the anvil. For he proved on that day, in the deeps of Angband, that even the humblest of Auli's children might aspire to works that would be counted among the wonders of all the ages of the world. Epilogue: The Blade That Waits, being an account of the later fates of the great work, as told by Elrond Half-Elven in the halls of Rivendell, and set down here for the remembrance of those who come after. Long are the years that have passed since the forging of the blade that bore within it the spirit of Thorek Ironforge, and many are the tales that have been told of its workings in the world. Yet few know the full truth of its wandering, for it was hidden from the sight of most, revealing itself only in the darkest hours when the light of hope burned lowest in the hearts of the free peoples. When first the weapon came to rest in the Field of Celebrant, after its passage through the halls of Angband, it lay concealed beneath a mound of earth and growing things, and about it sprang up flowers of such beauty that they seemed to hold starlight in their petals. The shepherds of the Eothiod, who dwelt in those lands in later days, would speak of that place as blessed, though they knew not why, and mothers would bring their children there to play beneath the singing trees. For 700 years the blade rested thus, its light hidden but not diminished, its power growing ever stronger as the memory of its making passed into legend. Yet it was not idle in its waiting, for the spirit of Thorek that dwelt within its steel was ever watchful. and his love for the free peoples had not diminished with his transformation. In dreams and visions, he would come to those who served the cause of light, offering counsel in their darkest hours and strength when their own failed them. It was in the year 1600 of the Second Age, when the shadow of Sauron began to lengthen across Middle-earth, and the first whispers of war stirred in Mordor, that the blade first stirred from its long slumber. Gil-galad the High King felt a calling in his heart, a summons that drew him eastward from his realm of Lindon, though he could not say what power beckoned to him. With him rode Elrond, herald of the king, and Círdan the shipwright, wisest of all the Eldar who remained in Middle-earth. "My lord," said Elrond as they made camp beside the waters of Mithithil, "what is this compulsion that drives us ever eastward? Never before have you departed your realm on so strange a quest, following naught but the calling of dream and the whispering of the wind." Gil-galad stood long in silence, his eyes turned toward the distant peaks of the misty mountain, and when he spoke, his voice was filled with wonder and foreboding. "Elrond, my friend, I feel the stirring of some great power that has long lain dormant, something wrought in the elder days, when the skill of making was at its height. Whether it be for good or ill, I cannot say, but I know that we must seek it out, for the time of its awakening is at hand." 3 days more they rode through the wild lands east of the Bruinen, following paths known only to the elves, and keeping ever to the hidden way. At last they came to the field of Celebrant, and there Gil-galad halted his horse and dismounted, for he felt the presence he had sought growing ever stronger. "Here," he said simply, and began to walk toward the mound where the starlit flowers bloomed. As he drew near, the earth began to tremble, and from beneath the green sward there came a light that grew ever brighter, until all who looked upon it were amazed. Then the ground opened as though of its own will, and there rose from the depths the blade that Thorek Ironforge had wrought in the fires of Ol's Ford. It hung in the air before them, blazing with inner fire, and its voice was like the sound of silver bells mixed with the rhythm of hammers upon the anvil. Upon its blade, the runes of power glowed with starlight, and in their depths could be seen the reflection of all the valor and sacrifice that had gone into its making. "Behold," whispered Círdan, his ancient eyes wide with wonder, "a blade wrought not by mortal hands alone, but by the power of the valor themselves. I see upon it the mark of Auli, the smith, and in its fire burns the spirit of one who loved the free peoples more than his own life." As they watched, the blade began to sing, and in its song they heard the voice of Thorek Ironforge himself, speaking to them across the years from his dwelling within the steel. "Lords of the Eldar, children of the West, the time of the blade's awakening is come, for a shadow stirs in Mordor that shall challenge all the works of light. Yet know this, I am not yours to command, for I was forged for a purpose greater than any single battle or war. When the hour of greatest need arrives, when the very fate of Middle-earth hangs in the balance, then shall I be wielded by one whose coming was foretold in the music of creation itself." Gil-galad reached out his hand toward the hovering blade, but it drew back from his touch, though not in rejection, but in gentle refusal. "I understand," said the High King with a sad smile. "You are not for our time, great weapon, but for a day yet to come. Yet, will you not aid us in the trials that now approach?" The blade's song grew softer, and in it they heard compassion mixed with regret. "Fear not, Gil-galad Erainion, for though I may not be wielded in the coming war, my light shall shine upon the field of battle, and all who fight for freedom shall feel their hearts strengthened by the knowledge that hope endures. The ring-bearer who comes in later days shall have need of greater aid than any sword can give, yet even he shall feel the blessing of the great smith's sacrifice." With these words the blade began to fade from sight, though its light lingered in the air like the memory of starshine. Yet it did not return to its hiding place beneath the earth, but passed instead to a realm between the seen and unseen, waiting for the hour of its final revelation. In the years that followed came the War of the Last Alliance, and great was the valor shown by elves and men united against the Shadow. On the slopes of Mount Doom, when Gil-galad and Elendil made their final stand against Sauron himself, some there were who later claimed to see a light like starfire dancing about their weapons, and to hear the sound of hammers ringing in the air. Whether this was the work of Thorek's blade, none could say for certain. Yet the wise believed that the great smith kept his promise, and that his spirit was present in that hour of ultimate trial. Long years passed, and the blade faded from the memory of most, becoming naught but a tale told by the fireside to children who half believed and half wondered. Yet in the hidden places of the world, among the wise who kept the old lore alive, the knowledge of its existence was preserved. In Rivendell and Lothlorien, in the Grey Havens and the halls of the Woodland Realm, the story was remembered and treasured, waiting for the time when it would be needed once more. It was in the year 2941 of the Third Age that the blade next revealed itself, though not in the manner that any might have expected. In the depths of the Lonely Mountain, when Smaug the Mighty lay dead upon the gold of his hoard, and the men of Lake Town mourned their burned city, there came from Dale a company of dwarves, unlike any seen in Middle-earth for many an age. These were the survivors of Erebor's royal line, led by Thorin Oakenshield, and with them came one whose presence caused the hidden blade to stir from its long dreaming. This was Balin, son of Fundin, whose grandfather had been that same Fundin the Stoutheart, who died defending Thorek Ironforge in the halls of Angband. The blood of heroes ran in his veins, and though he knew it not, he carried within his heart an echo of the great smith's sacrifice. On the night before the Battle of Five Armies, as Balin stood watch upon the ramparts of the rebuilt Dale, he felt a strange warmth upon his breast. There, hanging from a chain of mithril that had been his grandfather's last gift, was a small hammer wrought of the same strange metal as the great weapon itself. It began to glow with inner light, and in that glow, Balin saw visions of the past, his grandfather's heroic death, the forging of the great blade, and the sacrifice that had given it its power. "Grandfather," whispered Balin into the night wind, "your courage lives on, and the work of the great smith is not forgotten." In answer to his words, there appeared before him a figure wreathed in starlight, not Fundin himself, for he had passed long ago to the halls of his fathers, but Thorek Ironforge, in the form he had taken when his spirit joined with his creation. The great smith's face was kind but sorrowful, and in his eyes burned the fire of one who had seen both the glory and the grief of the world. "Son of Fundin's line," spoke Thorek, his voice like the whisper of wind through mountain halls, "thy grandfather died a hero's death in service to the light, and his sacrifice was not in vain. Tomorrow comes a battle that shall echo through the ages, and though the blade I forged is not yet ready for its final purpose, its blessing shall be upon all who fight for justice and freedom." "Tell me, great smith," said Balin, his voice filled with wonder and reverence, "when shall thy blade be wielded at last? For what purpose dost thou wait?" Thorek's form began to fade, even as he answered, becoming one with the starlight that filled the sky. "When the last heir of Isildur takes up his birthright, when the ring of power returns to the fire that made it, then shall the blade be revealed in its full glory. But that time is not yet come, and many sorrows must be endured ere the dawn breaks at last upon a world made free." The Battle of Five Armies was fought and won, and though the victory came at great cost, the forces of light prevailed. Yet even in triumph, the wise among the elves noted strange signs and portents, for they felt the stirring of old powers and the awakening of things that had long slept. In Dol Guldur, the necromancer revealed himself as Sauron returned, and the shadow that had lifted from Mirkwood began to spread once more across the world. It was then that Gandalf the Grey, mightiest of the Astari, began to understand the true significance of the blade that waited in the shadows. In the archives of Minas Tirith, he found ancient texts that spoke of a weapon forged in the elder days, created not by mortal craft alone, but by the sacrifice of one who loved the free peoples more than life itself. Long he pondered these writings, and at last he came to believe that the blade spoken of in prophecy was the same that Thorek Ironforge had wrought in the depths of Angband. "The wheel turns," murmured Gandalf as he stood upon the walls of the White City, watching the sunset paint the mountains red as blood. "The time of the final testing draws near, and all the works of the elder days shall be revealed at last. Yet I fear that even the great smith's sacrifice may not be enough to turn the tide of the darkness that is coming." For 60 years more, the blade waited in its hidden realm, and with each passing day, the shadow grew stronger. The one ring was found and lost, found again and hidden. And at last the hour came when it could be concealed no longer. The War of the Ring began, and with it came the testing of all the peoples of Middle-earth. On the fields of the Pelennor, when the horns of Rohan sang their defiance, and the ships of the corsairs came sailing up Anduin with black sails spread, the blade of Thorek Ironforge at last began its final awakening. From its dwelling between the worlds it watched as Aragorn, son of Arathorn, took up the reforged sword of his fathers and claimed at last his rightful throne. In that moment, the great smith knew that the hour prophesied in the music had come. Yet still the blade did not reveal itself, for its purpose lay not in the battles of armies, but in a humbler quest. Far to the east, two small figures crept through the desolation of Mordor, bearing a burden that grew heavier with each step. The ring-bearer and his faithful companion were near to despair, for the weight of their task seemed beyond all strength to bear. It was then, as Frodo Baggins stumbled upon the slopes of Mount Doom with his strength failing and his hope all but gone, that the blade of Thorek Ironforge made its final choice. Invisible to mortal eyes, but radiant in the sight of those who dwelt in the Blessed Realm, it descended from its hiding place and took up its station beside the ring-bearer. Sam Gamgee, faithful beyond all measure, felt a sudden warmth upon his back as he carried his master toward the Samath Nor. Though he could not see its source, he felt as though a great hand had been laid upon his shoulder in blessing and encouragement. The words came to his lips unbidden, spoken in a voice not quite his own. "Come, Mr. Frodo, I can carry you." And in that moment of ultimate sacrifice, when a simple gardener from the Shire took upon himself the burden of the world's salvation, the spirit of Thorek Ironforge found its final rest. For he had seen that the greatest heroism lay not in the forging of mighty weapons or the winning of glorious battles, but in the quiet courage of ordinary folk who chose to do what was right, though all the world stood against them. When the ring was destroyed and Sauron's power broken forever, the blade appeared one last time upon the field of the Morannon, blazing with such glory that all who looked upon it were filled with wonder. There it hung in the air before Aragorn the king, offering itself to his service, now that its true work was done. But the king of Gondor bowed his head in humility and would not take the weapon, for he understood that it belonged not to any one ruler or realm, but to all the free peoples who had fought and suffered for the sake of freedom. "Great blade," said Aragorn with reverence, "thy work is accomplished, and Middle-earth is saved through the sacrifice of thy Maker and the courage of those he inspired. Yet I am not worthy to wield thee, for thou art a holy thing, and thy place is not in the wars of this world, but in the peace that is to come." The blade sang one final song, a melody of joy and farewell that seemed to encompass all the sorrows and triumphs of the elder days. Then, as all watched in wonder, it began to fade from sight, not returning to any earthly resting place, but passing at last to the undying land, where Thorek Ironforge waited to greet his creation in the halls of Ole the Smith. Yet even as it departed from the circles of the world, the blade left behind a legacy that would endure to the end of day. Every smith who took hammer to anvil felt an echo of its making. Every warrior who fought for justice carried a spark of its fire, and every gardener who tended growing things in peace remembered the sacrifice that had made such peace possible. In the Fourth Age, when the dominion of men began and the time of the elves faded into memory, the tale of the smith of Belegost was still told around the hearth fires of the Shire and in the halls of Minas Tirith. Children would listen wide-eyed to the story of the dwarf who gave his life to forge hope itself, and bards would sing of the blade that waded through all the dark years for its moment of destiny. And some there were among the wise who said that though the blade had passed beyond the circles of the world, its influence lingered still. In every act of courage, in every moment when hope triumphed over despair, in every choice to stand against the darkness despite all odds, there could be felt the echo of Thorek's sacrifice and the ring of his hammer upon the anvil of eternity. Thus ends the full tale of the great work, from its beginning in the forges of Belegost to its culmination on the slopes of Mount Doom. Let all who hear this story remember that the greatest weapons are not always made of steel and flame, but of love and sacrifice, courage and hope. For it was not the blade itself that saved Middle-earth, but the spirit that dwelt within it, the spirit of one simple dwarf who chose to give everything so that others might live in freedom. May the flame imperishable burn forever in the hearts of all who hear this tale, and may the memory of Thorek Ironforge, the great smith of Belegost, inspire courage in the darkest hours until the ending of the world. Here truly ends the chronicle, written in the year 120 of the Fourth Age by the scribes of the king, that the deeds of the elder days might not be forgotten by those who inherit the peace that was bought with so great a price.